To all those who've joined us this morning, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you guys taking a little bit of time out of your schedule to join us for this webinar. I think this is going to be really useful. This is we're going to be talking about cybersecurity this morning and compliance. And I've asked Tom Fafinski to join us. I met Tom earlier in the year, presented to a group that I'm a part of, a group of MSP owners talking about law and how it relates to MSPs. And Tom just really demonstrated a kind of a unique amount of knowledge from my experience in the MSP or technology provider space. And so I asked him if he would join us this morning and kind of share some of his experience and understanding on how cybersecurity and liability and compliance all come together and the importance of it, because I think it's an area that often most businesses are kind of blind to, and even something I've been blind to in the past myself. And I spent a good deal of time trying to educate myself. So with that, Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you. We will have a Q&A session at the end. I do have the Q&A box open as part of the Zoom meeting. So if there is a question that kind of pops in your mind throughout the presentation, go ahead and pop that into the Q&A box, and we'll make sure all those get answered at the end. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Tom. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and then go from there.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Tom Fafinski, and I've been practicing for about 30 years and practicing law for about 30 years. And I started out in a wholly owned subsidiary of Emerson Electric before I was even licensed to practice. And because I was the young guy in the group, they said, well, we're going to send all licensing and technology related stuff over to Fafinski because he's the young guy, he's going to understand technology. And so I spent a bunch of time on non-disclosure agreements and intellectual property rights and licensing agreements, mostly dealing with refinery solutions and the implementation of Emerson's process control systems in refinery solutions. And then I declined an internal position as a corporate lawyer and took them out as a client. They're very kind to me to patronize me as a client when I hung my shingle in 1991. And so I ended up having this focus on technology. And when you end up in a particular arena, work just kind of migrates to you in that arena. And so I started getting a bunch of technology related clients, and the explosion of ERP implementations and CRM went before it was actually even referred to as CRM in the early 90s. My brother, who operates in the Twin Cities where I'm located, he started what is now his MSP. Back then it was outsourced IT on a break fix basis, which is like an hourly fee piece. And so I started doing work for him and then his friends as he got involved with national peer groups, and he would refer folks to me, and I would do that type of work. So I ended up, and I fell in love with the managed model, and really because of the issues that come up with the managed model, because you're dealing with interstate commerce and things like that, got really in depth with that piece, and which led me to a focus on cybersecurity, which has really been about in the last 5 years has really been the big issue for the small and medium and large businesses combined. I mean, it's a across the board type of issue. Mm-hmm. So it's really worth addressing. I think it's one of those pieces that are under considered. But most of my practice is geared towards representing managed service providers. So I am the clients of managed service providers. I don't do that much work for, but I end up counseling my MSP clients on these issues. So today you're going to get the perspective of why I've been encouraging MSPs to take this seriously for the last 5 years or longer, but it really has been the last 5 years where it's really taken off. There are a bunch of legal issues that come into play From the federal standpoint, we have the Federal Trade Commission Act, and the FTC Act prohibits unfair or deceptive acts, including privacy policies. And we're going to learn that most of the cyber-related stuff is geared towards protecting personally identifiable information. The Graham-Leach Bliley Act and Sarbanes-Oxley Act and the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act all came into play, each in their particular industry requiring privacy. So if you are affected, if you're a financial institution, if you are a healthcare provider, if you're doing credit transactions, the Fair and Accurate Credit Transaction Act disposal rule comes into play. We have FERPA, which is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which deals with educational institutions, and it's all coming into play for each particular industry. I think we'll see more of this, not less, and so handling of this personally identifiable information, which I'm going to call PII, so that I don't stumble through it the whole presentation. And we also have the Communications Act. The Communications Act regulates telecommunications providers and internet service providers, and anybody using voice over internet protocol systems comes within the Communications Act. So that's what's happening federally. And then we have a bunch of state rules in most jurisdictions where we have consumer protection laws that prohibit these same types of private information, prohibits the disclosure of it, considers it to be unfair or deceptive if you do. So these safeguards are all directed at how we store, and when I say we, I mean the clients of MSPs as well as the MSPs, how we store, handle, and protect this PII. We also have Social Security number protection laws dealing with the handling and protection of Social Security laws. And then there are laws at the state level that are dealing with disposal of PII and how we're supposed to take care of destroying that information when it's no longer needed. So personally identifiable information is nearly all MSPs, and nearly almost by definition all MSPs, and all of their customers are collecting or storing or managing some piece of PII for their customers. And it can be their, believe it or not, it can be things you derive from the phone book, their name and their address even qualifies. You got to take care of that. And it's really not a question of whether or not the small business is going to come into this knowledge. It's really when they're going to come into it. Unless you are, operating a lemonade stand and you're an all cash business and you don't use technology, you're probably going to be affected by handling of some of this PII. Mike, can you think of any other or any of your clients that don't deal with PII?
No, I would say all of our clients definitively have PII. Pretty much everyone we deal with has some sort of line of business application that's going to store, names, phone numbers, addresses of people. And I'd say even beyond that, most of our customers have some level of PFI, protected financial information in their business. And then we certainly also have a smattering of healthcare businesses that are going to fall under HIPAA as well. So I think, this is absolutely applicable to our entire client base.
So your client base needs to take reasonable measures to prevent breaches in order to have safety under these laws. And these reasonable measures are going to continue to be more stringent as time goes on because the industry is evolving. As it evolves, the requirements that other people the technology piece is evolving. The people in your industry, the businesses in your industry will continue to add protection, and that the reasonable, prudent person standard applies here. So that reasonable, your customers will need to have implemented, or business, I'm going to just say businesses need to have implemented. So that is a very important component that needs to be monitored by businesses. There are some events which, under the federal and most states, require notification to third parties. If personal identifiable information is lost or stolen by an employee or a third party, like the Home Depot breach. The Home Depot breach dealt with a really sophisticated piece of technology. It was a malware that was installed at the point of sale terminals to lift payment card information from individuals. So, you know, the part where I heard a comedian say that they thought that grocery stores had given up on customer service, because now when you go to I forgot the guy's name, he's just hilarious too. It was on Netflix. It's Sebastian something, I think. He's a really funny guy. It's worth seeing. But he was explaining that now we're checking ourselves out, that, you know, what used to be something that somebody would go through training exercise to be a cashier is now being thrust upon the general public.
Right.
And his proposition was they've given up on customer service.
Yep.
So what they did was they took those point of sale terminals that people were doing the self-check on, that were really being unguarded, other than the youngest person employed at the store is there as your help person if you have problems with it, just like I was when I was in Emerson Process Controls legal department. That led to and you know, they hit Home Depot, for crying out loud. That's a huge enterprise. $27.25 million settlement was reached there on that deal. That was a costly mistake for Home Depot, but they installed it at the point of sale terminals. Likewise, there was a Dairy Queen breach, and in the Dairy Queen breach, they almost 400 stores were affected by this. It was malware that was installed at the cash registers. So now we had it from the point of sale piece where the individuals were self-checking, to now we had it to the Dairy Queen where it's dealing with a non-self-check item. They're grabbing information about credit cards and the data on the back of the credit cards, the account numbers and the CV numbers. Adobe, big technology company, had nearly 3 million encrypted credit cards, plus all of the login data was stolen. That one was done by a hacker that was able to access it. The one that really probably gave everyone cause to pause was the Target breach. Do you remember the Target breach, Mike?
I do.
And do you remember how that actually happened?
I think it was Wi-Fi, right? They were sitting in the parking lot, and the Wi-Fi wasn't secured as properly as it was supposed to be. It kind of seems am I remembering the right breach?
Yeah, and it went one step further. It was they were accessing the Wi-Fi of a company called Fazio Mechanical.
Right.
Fazio Mechanical firm. Yeah, big HVAC firm.
Right.
And Fazio had a contract with Target. So they were able to access the Wi-Fi into Fazio and then backdoor into Target. And they took $110 million consumer information. Now that was done with a combination of malware, but and phishing. So do you want to explain what a phishing attack is, Mike?
Yeah, sure. Well, phishing, and it's something we've seen a lot in our environment recently. But phishing is a well-crafted email that looks highly legitimate, that comes into your mailbox. You know, comes from places might come from Target. We see a lot from like Amazon, UPS, FedEx, but they look legitimate, look like something you'd be expecting. And the whole purpose of it is to solicit you to enter in your username and password. We've also seen some that have come in that look like they're from Microsoft, say, hey, please reset your username and password. And then what they do is, and oftentimes they're sophisticated enough where you enter the credentials and they actually pass you into the system you're expecting. So you're very unaware of, hey, I just gave a hacker my credentials, but they're putting up a piece of software website in the middle that looks legitimate and capturing this information, and then they have access to either your email or even your local network. And I also think I just want to point out too, Tom, because I think you're making an excellent point with even talking about the target breach. Is something we see our clients that they don't think real hard about often is when they do let these uh, other vendors into their space, like an HVAC or a copier company or some sort of monitoring organization that wants to put some sort of technology on their network, and they just say, "Oh, okay, yeah, just plug right in," but not slowing down to think about what is the liability they just added to their own network, and what is the insecurity potentially added to their network by just letting someone add something to their network without properly securing it. So that's a really great point.
And we're going to talk more about the types of things that MSPs can do. But Mike, I'm going to ask you a question about just technical,
Mm-hmm.
what an MSP can do from a technical standpoint to prevent phishing attack, just software-based solutions, not training stuff, not education, not policies, but software-based solutions that will eliminate a phishing attack.
Sure. Well, the two things that we've been doing recently, and you're kind of hamstringing me because I believe strongly in the human firewall and the training piece. But the two technical things that we've been doing are multi-factor authentication, so that if the password is compromised, if it is given up, there's a secondary layer. And multi-factor is kind of the concept of using a secondary device like your cell phone to have a code sent to it that is time-based. So that's a really big piece in protecting against after the attack. The other thing that we've been doing is incorporating Microsoft
Right.
has a component called ATP, or Advanced Threat Protection, that does advanced phishing detection, where they're actually scanning for known phishing type attacks, known URLs, known servers. They do deep scanning on these. So those two pieces are pretty powerful to protect against those types of attacks right now.
So folks, understand what Mike just explained. The answer to this is the only thing that can be done in advance of a phishing attack. The only thing that you can really do is have a technical solution in place from a technical standpoint, is to have a technical solution in place that identifies something that looks like prior known phishing attacks. That's it. So from a technical standpoint, if you hire an MSP that's not well versed in cyber security, they're not going to be giving you the training that you need to understand what phishing attacks look like. The training required for employees to not share information. The physical thing, like for instance, you can test your facility. Says one of the vulnerabilities, if I can walk into your and get past a reception desk into the back offices, then you're ripe for a phishing attack. That can happen, and it has nothing to do with the technical components. All they have to do is find a laptop that hasn't retired, and they can jump on, or a computer that hasn't retired. So it's really important to select the right MSP and to elect to have the services associated with training and policies and procedures for your employees, because phishing attacks, there's just not a lot you can do from a technical standpoint. Now in the Fazio deal, then they use that access. So phishing is another way of saying an authorized person shared the information that they shouldn't have shared.
They gave somebody else.
And so now you've got
company.
a person that has this information. Now, and now they have access to the system, and they can drop a piece of malware. Mike, would you explain what malware is?
Yeah, sure. So malware is a close cousin. We've all heard of computer viruses over years. Malware is kind of a close cousin, but it's a little bit more insidious sometimes in nature, because what it tries to do is, rather than just corrupt the system, is exfiltrate in many cases information, or ransomware is a big kind of subcomponent of that. See, where it actually encrypts your data and holds it hostage. So not so long ago, a lot of the people that create these things, these nefarious actors, realized that there wasn't much money in viruses and just crashing organizations, and that a lot of small business specifically had reasonable measures. We had backup in place, and if we lost our data, we could probably tolerate a certain amount. But people thought, hey, nobody cares about my data. There's no real value to it. Well, the value is to you, the owner of the business. And they said, hey, if we can hold them hostage, right, we'll encrypt it, hold it hostage for a ransom payment, then we can monetize our attacks. We can actually make this worth our while from a monetary standpoint. And then that's what they've very, very effectively done. And we've seen ransom attacks in the hundreds of thousands of dollars and the millions of dollars, depending on the size of the organization. And what we're seeing even more recently is, even if you pay the ransom, sometimes they'll ransom you to get your data back, and then they'll have exfiltrated, they'll have downloaded the data, then they come back a second time and say, hey, okay, you got your data back, but if you don't want us to release it, publish it on a website, release it to your competitors, let all your vendors and partners and clients know, then you got to pay a second ransom, and you still don't even know if they're not going to do it and come back for a third time in future. So it's kind of this huge just snowball that gets away from you.
So that malware is just, I mean, it's a terrible thing to have malware installed. And this is how devious and insidious it becomes. They will actually monitor your system to determine how the duration of your backups, and they will sit quietly in the background for 100 days. And before they launch their attack, if they know that your backups aren't occurring, and let's say you do backups and then you start reusing stuff after 90 days or something, actually sit and wait for you not to have a clean backup, or keep their malware embedded even in a full restore on the backup, and then they'll punish you for that piece. And if you think, wow, this can't happen to us, we've got pieces in place. Well, it happened to eBay. eBay has online auction giant site. Hackers used the credentials of 3 corporate employees that were accessed through a phishing attack, and had complete access, eBay system for 229 days. Unbelievable that they were able to do this, and of course it led to a huge loss and settlement of loss of PII. There's situations where PII is used by authorized persons for authorized persons for unauthorized purposes. Morrison Supermarket lost 100,000 customers. The bank details of the 100,000 customers, their PII, and it was done with the assistance of a perpetrator, one person inside this large organization. The perpetrator ended up getting 8 years, but essentially completely ruined the credit of 100,000 customers of Morrison supermarket chain. So we see unauthorized access by unauthorized people too, like in the Sony breach involving North Korea came in just to show what they could do, and they went to Sony to prevent them from releasing a movie. I mean, it is a huge issue, and it's not just in place. I'm not going to be harmed. If Home Depot can be harmed, if Target can be harmed, if PF Chang's can be harmed, they lost a bunch of information. If eBay can be harmed, you are, and they have all the resources in place. They just weren't thinking about it. Then you need to address it. So what happens when you have the breach? Most jurisdictions require that you notify. Here up on the slide, you'd have to notify the affected customers, employees, third parties, law enforcement, credit reporting agencies, and business partners. So there's an obligation to notify if you have a situation. The National Standards and Technology published a plan, a framework for improving critical infrastructure for businesses. This isn't just for MSPs, this is for businesses, all businesses. It was done pursuant to an executive 2014. It is suggestions. It became the industry standard, but it's not a law, but it's just suggestions. So it's totally voluntary. You don't have to do it, but it really has become the standard of care in the business industry because it's been around now for almost 7 years. So if you don't have a NIST plan in place, you should think about getting a NIST plan, which deals with, and we'll go on and talk about it in a little bit here, but which deals with this stuff. And that NIST is that plan, having that plan in place, just having the plan. If you don't, you probably can't meet the standard of care. If you do have it in place and it's reasonable, you'll likely be able to meet the standard of care. Now, what does that mean? That means if you have a loss of PII and your customers come to you and say, hey, you got all my PII and I got damaged by it, they have a claim against you under one of the various acts. And if you can demonstrate that you adhered to the reasonable standard of care because you had this NIST in place, then you'll likely be able to fend that case off. Here's a crazy little thing about cybersecurity. It's a reactive set of solutions that you're in place. So if there's a known piece of malware that's out there and you're not guarding against it, then you will likely not be able to meet the standard of care to defeat a claim for anybody who has a loss based upon it. If it is a brand new attack and it couldn't be contemplated, then you're likely okay because it's a new form and the industry doesn't have knowledge of it yet. So if the stuff is out there and exists and you don't do anything, like for instance, if you just don't have a firewall, well, that's crazy. I mean, that's just crazy not to have a firewall. If you don't have a firewall in place, you will not meet it, so because the industry's caught up to that. 10 years ago, you might have gotten away without having a firewall and not having liability, but now you don't. The courts will refer to the NIST framework as a voluntary standard of care for you. This is the stuff that we're trying to protect on. If you are a business that collects electronic information, you store it in any way, you access it in any way, you transfer it or manage it in any way, and you dispose of it or do dispose of it, because if you don't dispose it of the information and then it gets released pursuant to an attack, well, the customer is going to say, okay, you had your NIST plan in place, but you didn't follow the instructions on when you didn't need this data anymore. If you don't need the data anymore, but you continue to store it under the theory of why would I get rid of this? I might need it again someday, maybe. That kind of hoarder type of mentality. I've got lumber that is from a construction project I did 13 years ago because someday I might need that 2x4. And it's that type of thing. If you're keeping that data, then the court system, the juries will look at it and say, well, that may have been really efficient for you as a business to keep that in case you needed it, but it really stunk for the individual who lost their PII under a new attack. Because so even if it's a totally new attack and you've taken adequate safeguard measures on all other types of cybersecurity breaches that are known to the industry, but you just kept the data, and there's a new one that comes in, you're going to be found liable because why did you keep that data? You didn't need to keep it. So you got to have a plan for that piece. But it should involve employee awareness, and it should safeguards to have in place and security measures. The safeguards are a multitude. You have to have an administrative safeguard, which says that passwords are going to change and the multi-level authentication type stuff. You have to have technical things like firewalls and software, malware, software that detects that stuff. And you have to have physical precautions to protect against it. You should work with your MSP to develop all of those. And so there are some MSPs that will approach you and they'll say, yeah, we got the cybersecurity all taken care of. If they have not trained you at all on administrative policies that need to be in place, they're not somebody you should be working with. If they have not talked to you about the physical protocols of it, which is kind of the newest part of the thing, you should ask them, what are the physical protocol pieces that we should be looking at? So those are the three types of safeguards. MSPs are squarely in the technical component, and historically they've addressed the technical pieces, but not the administrative and physical stuff. And it really is moving. It's already moved to the administrative, and it's moving towards the physical too. Now that doesn't mean that those services haven't been declined by you, because sometimes you'll be presented with an opportunity. You're like, hey, we can give you all this training about keeping your environment protected, but it's going to cost additional money. And we can do on-site audit inspections of your facility, but it's going to cost you additional money. And you say, you know what? I got to cut somewhere. I'm going to cut those pieces. What does that mean? That means you have no protection on the MSP. It is, you are riding without any sort of protection on that piece, because the MSP is not going to be rendering services that you're not paying them to do or that they haven't been engaged to do. So consider adding administrative and physical if you haven't already.
Tom, I wonder if I could jump in for 1 second, because I love what you're saying.
Yes,
here.
Please.
One of the things that we've struggled with, and we have, and maybe you could lend some weight to the conversation. We have a handful of law offices as clients, and one of the things that we've talked to them about over time is specifically the retaining of very, very old data, and how it is inadvisable. And in some cases, we've bumped into struggles with there's such a preponderance of data that we've struggled to back it up, and we're coming back every few years and saying, hey, you gotta add more hard drive space, you've got to add more backup, and we're like, oh my goodness, why do we gotta do this? Like, well, you guys either got to do that or you've got to get rid of data. And then we try to have a conversation about getting rid of data, and it's like they start to freak out a little bit. Oh, you can't get rid of our data, and stuff that maybe even is 10 and 12 and 15 years old, cases that are long cold. Could you kind of maybe even from a legal expertise speak about just your perspective on that?
Yeah. So my perspective on the legal industry, it is different because we have ethical obligations which transcend statutes of limitations. So most statute of limitations in my jurisdiction end at 6 years. You'll find in other jurisdictions it might be longer. But the statute of limitations doesn't run for some claims until there's a discovery, and then we have these ethical obligations that come into play. So we don't really need the information for the purposes of operating our business. We really need the information for the purposes of protecting our license. That doesn't mean it has to be active and there and available on the servers and systems. You can retire it, archive it, store it separately so that you're not processing all the time. But yeah, in the legal industry, it is really hard to get rid of data. Now, in 2004, I went paperless, and it was a nightmare to go paperless because we had to go through every file from 1991 to 2004.
Wow.
And of course, we retained all of our drafts. Why wouldn't you keep it? It was done in paper. Every draft was done. So we'd have to get down to the final draft of what we had. And then we'd have to determine whether or not, if it was filed with a court, then we don't have to keep it if it wasn't filed with a court, or that type of stuff. So when we got rid of it, we had a 30-yard dumpster that was brought in. And we had to stage the disposal of the information. So it was staged inside our secure office. And then on one particular day, when we had a couple of rooms filled almost literally floor to ceiling. It wasn't quite to the ceiling, but almost literally with bankers boxes. We walked it all out to the dumpster. And then we went with the dumpster, we went and witnessed the destruction of the data, the complete destruction of the data. And it had to be destroyed all at the same time. So I think it was burned. We were looking at shredding and just decided, let's just burn it. And we were about 3 miles away from the Minneapolis incinerator. And so we just took it to the incinerator.
Wow.
But it was, and at that point I said, okay, I am not keeping I am never going to keep an original document unless I absolutely have to. So from 1991 to 2004, so that's 13 years, I had a 30-yard dumpster destroyed. From 2004 to 2020, that's 14 years, I have one cabinet with 4 drawers that are filled with originals. That's it. I'm never doing it again. And everything is stored, everything is data in the cloud. But yeah, there are ethical pros in some pieces. So, but that doesn't mean that you have to have it accessible. You can lock it up and put it in a separate environment. It doesn't have to be in your operating environment. It just has to be accessible.
And that's what we've really started to try to encourage people to do
So,
at the very least is to put it in cold storage of some sort so we can bring it back if we need to, but get it out of the where if there's a compromisation, it's something we have to consider.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So under the NIST standards, you should have a WISP plan. A WISP plan is a written information security program. I sometimes call it that you should develop it and implement it. You should work with your MSP to do it. You should work with your lawyer to do it as well. You should to understand what laws apply to your industry, what regulations apply to your industry. It should be an enterprise-wide implementation, not just the IT group, not just a few people, not just the CFO. It should be industry-wide. It should identify who's responsible for leading that program. It should identify the type of customer information we're going to collect, store, share, where it's going to be collected. The plan should conduct risk assessments to identify and manage the risks and how we're addressing the gaps, if possible. You should define administrative, physical, and technical policies, all 3 categories. By the way, when there is a cybersecurity catastrophic failure, about 60% of the time, in my experience, this is how it happens. It's a phishing deal, and the phishing leads to the deposit of a malware. And that is about, maybe it's not 60, maybe it's 50, but that is the huge component of it. That is really difficult for an MSP to prevent. That phishing, because there's just nothing you can do other than the training. So if you're not dealing with the administrative, that's probably about half the time. And you have no claims against anybody. You don't have claims against your employee who gave it away. You just don't. And then once the malware gets detected, then you address it. But that's sometimes when the malware is there, you can't undo it. Can't get that horse back in the barn. Your WISP plan should ensure that there are safeguards that are implemented and maintained. You should ensure that your service providers have adequate security measures and monitored when they are accessing it, so that your MSP is opening up the gate and allowing them in when they need to be in for a timed period, and understanding who's doing it, why they're doing it, with oversight and possibly sanctions if they do something wrong. And then that program should be reviewed and tested periodically. And that truly is what you should be doing in your WISP plan. WISP plan should probably be done in conjunction with your law firm, so that you can measure how this plan, the priorities, especially when it comes to the gaps analysis, how you're addressing that. If you work with, let's say you work with Mike and you develop a plan, and Mike comes back and says, you should do this, 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 this. But you're looking at it, you're like, okay, that is ideal in a perfect world, but we're living in a post-COVID pandemic recession here. I can't afford to do all that stuff. So if you start taking down priorities and you say, okay, this is how I said, then what ends up happening is, if there's a breach and it's in the places where the priorities that you did not have as high, the communications between your MSP and you are going to be discoverable to anybody who's affected by it. So there's one particular case, I remember the name, but in retrospect, it happened about 2 months ago. In retrospect, they hired an attorney to come in to try to protect those conversations under the attorney-client privilege. And the court said, no, that doesn't work. You can't use the attorney-client privilege to undo that piece. So they got stuck. I mean, they were literally stuck, and all of the information was disclosed about the priority of taking it on. So if you're working with Mike in terms of developing your plan, include your local attorney, or include us. We'd be happy to do it if we can, or refer you to somebody that we can, because you want that attorney-client privilege information to protect you, that attorney-client privilege to protect you from that information being disclosed. Because if it's communications involving your lawyer, even if it's involving a third party who's coming in to that relationship, then you will have protection afforded to you. So they're going to look at, do you have processes to keep the PII inventory current? Are you maintaining security levels? Are you encrypting? Are you truncating? Do you want an truncation, Mike?
So I think what you're referring to is, like, especially with like social security numbers, not keeping, or at least not displaying the full number, right? You're Xing out the first 5 digits, only showing the last 4 digits, stuff of that nature. So anytime, typically what we would, and often this is something within database systems, line of business systems, that most systems do now, but it's important to recognize, and especially where I think a lot of people start to get off the rails a little bit, is when they're starting to build ancillary solutions with spreadsheets and Word documents and stuff, and they're not understanding the need for this. But only showing the most needful information and not showing full information in case there's a breach is kind of that idea of truncating data.
And when you are in an environment, this is the biggest exposure that I see, folks. This darn phone. You say, well, I'm going to save money and not have that devices covered by the MSP because they're charging by the device, say. And so, my employees, they have a laptop, they have a tablet, and they have a smartphone. And we're just going to cover the laptop. They can live with it on the other stuff. Well, the employee links up and connects with their telephone, and they link up and connect with their tablet, and they're unprotected. And you have an open door. It's an open door. Now it's an open door only to somebody who knows that door is there, but it's an open door. And something you should really be considering is protecting those devices and with some level of protection with your MSP. This thing also can be a beautiful safety device too, because if it's being protected and your employees are in the public, which we're getting a lot with work from home, where they are working from their personal residence, and now when they return, they'll probably be working more remotely. They'll be working from coffee shops and restaurants and taverns and you name it, and they jump onto the public Wi-Fi. And what happens when you jump onto public Wi-Fi, Mike?
Well, you're exposed if you don't have a firewall running on your device. You potentially expose anyone else sitting on that public Wi-Fi. The name of your machine is often visible on that. Running scans on it sometimes can even show the name of your corporate network. So there's a lot of information that is potentially exposed that would give a potential hacker clues to who you are, where you're from, and what potential vulnerabilities would be.
And then when you go up and get your coffee refilled, and your laptop is on the table and it's opened and it's set to close if it's inactive for 10 minutes, and you go up and you get your coffee refilled, somebody can slip through and just drop a thumb drive in, and your employee's device has been exposed. So the safety thing, and this is a really simple safety thing. First, make sure your tablet, because most of the time people will be using their tablet in the coffee shops, not their laptops. That's just the way it is. And so if you are using a tablet, and especially if it's an unprotected device, have them not connect to the public Wi-Fi. Even if it looks like, it says Starbucks coffee, well, that looks good. Well, they can call their Wi-Fi connection to have access to your piece. Somebody can establish a Wi-Fi connection, call it whatever they want. Device connected to their cell phone hotspot is going to give you far more protection than jumping onto any public Wi-Fi. Now that's a training piece that your MSP, if you engage them to do training, they'll go through that stuff with you.
Absolutely. And I was going to add to that too, not just a tablet or a PC. Be careful the networks that you're going on, the public Wi-Fi you're going on with your phone. Just a few years ago, we had an attorney who traveled overseas and his iPhone actually became compromised overseas. His email subsequently got compromised and he brought it back into their law office. And we had this whole issue of things we had to deal with because that iPhone had gone out in the world, had gotten on a rogue access point somewhere and had actually gotten infected. So even those of you in the Mac world that know and love Mac, that think Macs are impervious, they're not. They're technology like any other device, and they need to be protected as well, and still need to have a high level of user caution.
So most of the information, cybersecurity applies to physical documents as well. It doesn't discriminate against electronic versus physical. So if you've got paper, you should cross-cut that paper. Data, if you're retiring equipment, you should wipe the data before you discard or reuse the equipment with somebody else, especially when you have employees that if you have a key employee that's getting a new device and the old device is going to be used by somebody else, well, that key employee may have had access to information the other person might not have access to. And it's not so much that the other person you're looking at and say, well, they're honest, they'll do the right thing. It's what hands that computer falls into or what other access provisions those folks have, because that data is still there, even if you have them signing in as a different user. Hackers can access the other data and plant devices for it. So you should do with mobile devices, encryption, truncation, access and transmission of PII should be regulated. There should be risk allocation. Look to the MSP for delivery and compliance and data security programs and risk assessments. Consider hiring your MSP to do a risk assessment. Not just the technical, but the physical and the administrative. I think when you hire an MSP, it's actually better to hire somebody who's had issues through customers and has dealt through those issues. So be careful of the MSP that says, we've never had any sort of cybersecurity breach ever even attempted. Nothing never happened and no customers ever. Well, all that's telling me is that when you select that person, they're going to have zero experience if you're the first. So you don't want to be the first. So it's not necessarily a bad thing if they've had a security incident. I'm not saying you should stay away from them, but you should be, well, what are you doing to make sure that you're adequately trained? We already talked about the breaches, the administrative, physical, and technical components. These are the reasons that it happens, the failure to have a WISP, access through vendors, bring your own device, failing to have regular password changes and multi-level authentication, granting access to everybody for all of the information in the organization, even if they don't need it. You have staff people that are floating through that don't need financial information from your customers. They just don't need it. So why provide them that access? Keeping old data, a big piece is having a place for terminated employees. These are all administrative related safeguards. Here are some other administrative related safeguards. Insufficient resources, not enforcing your policies. Your policy says you're going to change the password every X period of time, but you don't, and there's no ramifications if they don't. Running through technical, here's a whole list. I'll share this with you, Mike, and you can forward it on to members, but here's all the risks in the technical thing, and you got to have safeguards in place for that. Here's some other technical pieces data housed off-site and transmission pieces. And the physical safeguards, restricting the physical access to where the PII is located, that's the big one. Failing to limit access to equipment, use, transmit, or store it. I want to make sure, I'm at 1 hour, I want to make sure if there are any questions out there that I'm addressing. Anybody have any questions?
We don't have any questions in the box at the moment, but if anyone does have a question, feel free to put those in the Q&A box, and I can field those over to Tom. While we're waiting, just give people a minute or two to type, Tom. I think, first of all, I think this has been terrific, and I know we could probably easily go for a couple hours trying to cover all the topics that come up under this. It's just a very, very deep but important topic. I wrote down a few things here. I'm just looking at my notes. Yeah. Can you talk about, here's probably one of the things that we bump into, because we do deal in the small to mid space. I'd say our predominant client has 100 seats or less, 100 endpoints or less in their environment. And a lot of people have maybe one of two kind of philosophies on this. One I actually heard last year from a lawyer, kind of told me that if anything ever happened, and specifically in a HIPAA environment, where if they ever got audited or they ever had some sort of breach, they just give the keys to the government and walk away from the business. It was kind of a cavalier attitude. So there's kind of that kind of standpoint of we can't afford to spend on this. We'll just walk away. The other attitude or kind of posture we've seen is, hey, we're a small business. We're just, nobody's ever going to pay attention if our data is lost, and just not taking it seriously. So maybe you could speak a little bit to and you talked early on, like all the compliance factors that, all the different federal and state stuff, but what are the rubber meets the road consequences for if there is some sort of breach? And I know it probably varies state to state, but you could just give us kind of maybe some high level examples. What are the consequences, even for a small business, if they don't take this stuff seriously from a legal standpoint, not even just from a business impact, but from a legal standpoint? What are the consequences?
That's a great question. The impact company that's affected can be significant. So that entity, and it normally has a contract right with their customers. So we look to the contract to determine the liabilities. That doesn't mean that the company doesn't voluntarily assume a duty to act on their behalf outside of the contract in something we call a negligence lawsuit. Kind of like if you go to a doctor and the doctor renders care for you, if it turns out to be malpractice, which is essentially in a negligence case, if it turns out to be malpractice, the claim is against the doctor and the clinic. It's not just against the doctor. Practice is, we have malpractice when you're dealing with accountants and doctors, and malpractice is just a fancy way of saying professional negligence. So depending on the arena that you're in, you may be held to a higher standard than the profession, the standard of care for that profession. So if you're a medical clinic, you will be held to that higher standard. If you're just a regular run-of-the-mill, small to medium-sized business, and it's not a profession, you're still going to be held to a negligence standard, which is a harder standard to defend against. It's easier to prove a negligence claim than it is to prove a malpractice claim, because in a negligence claim, all we got to do is say you didn't do what an ordinary, reasonable, and prudent person would do. In a malpractice claim, it's the plaintiff has to demonstrate you didn't do what an ordinary, reasonable, prudent professional in your environment did. That's a higher standard, not just a reasonable person, but a professional. So what happens is, if you are accessing this data, customer has claims against the corporation, and sure, you can turn the keys over, claims to anybody in that organization who voluntarily assumed access to that data to operate it. So I would look at it, you see it happen all the time, where a company and individuals in that company are sued. So I don't think you get to walk away with just the keys on it. I think you still have to defend on the negligence piece. You still have exposure on the negligence piece.
That's good. Okay. Thank
And
you.
without even demonstrating a piercing of the corporate veil. So, courts could look at it and say, well, you treated it as an ultra ego of yourself, and therefore we're going to come at. Answer your question, Mike?
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. And I think that's because that's one of the things. And I think you kind of really wrapped it into the legal terminology of kind of what my understanding already was. But that's, something we've really tried to express to our clients over the years, is that, this is important. And it's not just, having a cavalier attitude is not going to solve anything. So that's good. You use the term frequently, and I know this is kind of a legal context, but could you maybe give a little clarification to the term reasonable? And you talk about having done reasonable things from an IT perspective, having done a reasonable thing from a policy perspective. Give us a little bit of a context of, again, maybe it rubber meets the road of where does reasonable start? And I know it's kind of an open definition, but help give us maybe like where do we start if we want to approach being reasonable from a professional standpoint, both kind of as an MSP, but also from our clients. What is reasonable for them to start to try to do?
So I sound like a politician because I can't give you an answer that's clear and succinct on it, because it's really the ultimate arbiter of what is reasonable is the jury.
Sure.
So there isn't a statute out there that says you're acting reasonably if you do this. The jury is charged with what would a reasonable person in this environment who's acting in a prudent manner, what measures would they have adopted to prevent against the event occurring? And so it's different in different things, So if you are a tax lawyer, for instance, and you propose something and it turns out to affect the client adversely, the standard is not what a reasonable, prudent attorney would do, because that's not who they hired.
Mm-hmm.
It's what a reasonable, prudent tax lawyer would do. So it elevates to the higher standard for the negligence piece. Same is true in the medical, same is true. And give me an example of a customer industry that you have, not their name, just the industry that they're in.
Well, sure. We have a fair amount of manufacturing, all different types. I mean, it's a very strong manufacturing region. We're here in Northeastern Pennsylvania, so that's a strong one for us.
So in manufacturing, what you're dealing with a lot are procurement cards that your customers have. They have the equivalent of a credit card. They're making orders and you're receiving electronic payment through procurement cards. And that's your business. That's your standard commerce is through these procurement cards, say, or electronic payment. If you store this data and you don't take adequate measures to do that, and that data gets released, so that all has to happen, the data gets released. So up until then, as long as nobody's hurt, no foul. I mean, no harm, no foul, truly. But once there's a pain by somebody, now they come in and they say, the manufacturing industry, this is what they do to protect against disclosure of procurement cards or electronic payment information. And so that becomes the standard that you have to live by, and you don't even know what it is. And the jury gets to define it. And so each side would present their case, normally through expert testimony, that in the industry, these are the measures that are taken. So your MSP is going to give you a better idea of what you ought to do. If you're not doing what your MSP says you ought to do, for sure, then that's probably going to be your standard that you're failing to meet. So if your MSP comes in and said, you really need to do the following things, and then you could do these things, you should do these things, but you don't have to, but you should. And so that's another level. And then you could do these things too. You don't really need to, but you could, and that gives you more. Have to, that's going to for sure be that reasonable standard. You should probably going to meet in that reasonable standard. You're probably going to have a little dispute on it between the parties at the time of trial, but you don't want to get to trial because it's way too expensive.
So let me, and I don't have any questions in the queue right now.
Now,
So I'll just throw one, kind of one more thing at you. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, because maybe I'll learn something here. Here's how I have kind of gone after reasonable, because it's something we talk about in HIPAA, and we talk about a lot of security things. What I've told my customers as the start is, and I kind of flip it around and say, what's unreasonable? Unreasonable is doing nothing. You've got to be doing something. Right. And unreasonable is not reviewing it periodically to say, how can we improve it? And unreasonable is not working in some way to improve what we've already identified is inefficient or insufficient. Would you agree with that's a kind of a good standpoint, or would you revise that in some way?
Absolutely, I agree. Yeah, absolutely. And I have a little bit more clarity on your question too. So one of the things is having that plan, having that WISP in place, your NIST plan. You really should have something like that. If you do that and the plan kind of hits all corners of the deal, you probably right now can meet the standard of care, and you're probably going to be good. Work with your MSP to do that. Work with your attorney to do that. But yeah, it's easier to define what's unreasonable. Doing nothing is unreasonable,
right?
than it is to define where reasonableness starts.
Sure.
It is reasonable to have a plan. It's probably unreasonable to have a WISP plan.
Good.
And I've listed here on the slide all of the pieces. Now I'm on slide 18 of 29, so I can keep plowing through it here. If you'd like, Mike, I just recognize that we're beyond the hour.
No, we're at the top of the hour.
I don't know how long I'm happy to go long.
No, I think I'll probably cut you off there, Tom, and I do super appreciate all the content and your willingness to keep going. I know I also have some stuff scheduled coming up here. I know other people have stuff scheduled, so I want to respect the time. We kind of told people we're already just a tad over the hour. Tom, in closing, if any of our viewers want to get a hold of you, they have more questions or want to engage you, how do they get a hold of you? How do they reach out to your firm? All right, Tom.
I think actually my personal website is down. My personal website, I think, is down right now. I don't know why. I got to figure that part out. I'm a technology attorney. I'm not a technologist, for crying out
loud. Fair enough, sir. Fair enough. Well, Tom, thank you so much for your time today. I do super appreciate it. I learned a little bit. I appreciate your engaging with us and being willing to educate our customers on this topic. And I'm sure that we'll be engaging more in the future. For those that are watching, I have engaged Tom. He is actively working with our organization to help make us better in these things, make us more aware, because it is important to us, something we take very seriously in protecting our clients and making sure we're fully knowledgeable and aware of all the things that we need to do, and so that we're bringing best practices and awareness downstream to our client base here in Northeastern Pennsylvania. So again, Tom, thank you so much, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me.
You're so welcome.
Super. Thanks for having me.
All right.
Talk to Mike about administrative processes and the physical processes, not just technical.
Perfect. Thanks, Tom. Have a good one.
Take care. Bye.